At the end of the day, who's recruiting who? I'm Ray Myers. Welcome to Craft versus Cruft, and today we have our second ever interview episode. And just to give you an idea of how seriously we treat continuity on Craft vs. Craft, we have today the person that introduced me to Steven Weinberg, who was in the previous episode on interviews. And Taylor, I'll let you introduce yourself here.
Hello. Hey, Steven. If you're the only person that watches this. My name is Taylor Poiry. I'm a tech recruiter based in Chicago for Motion Recruitment.
All right. And what does Motion Recruitment do?
Tech staffing. We are a localized and specialized business model. So I focus on like the SRE platform, DevOps, and IT space.
Excellent. And there are, a number of other specializations that other teams at Motion do, I take
Every
it.
tech talent you could use if you need Java, Ruby, front end, .NET, BA, Salesforce, we do it all.
All right. So
Service pitch done there.
the tagline of the interview with Steven, which was from the perspective of, a hiring manager. Tagline of that is selling yourself in interviews. So what about that idea that an interview is a sale? What do you think about that? Is that how you think about job interviews?
To some extent, yes, but to some extent, no. To paint some context, I've primarily done like DevOps and SRE placements for the last 4.5 years. So like for primarily of the people that I'm primarily placing, they don't need to sell their background, but they do need to align their background with the company they're interviewing for. So that's not necessarily as sales focused. It's more like project to project, product to product, role to role, and like how that compares. I feel like when engineers at like that senior to staff level are having to sell themselves, they might not be the right fit. Maybe if you're a junior person, maybe, but as you get more senior, I think it's all like at the end of the day, here's what I'm looking for. What are you looking for? Kind of combos.
Let's talk a little bit about the difference between internal recruiters that work for a company and independent recruiters such as yourself that work for an agency. Because this is one of the most common questions I get when people talk about recruiters, because they get very confused if they're newer to this aspect of the industry. So for starters, just talk about what the actual differences in how those different types of recruiters operate, and then after that we'll get to what that might mean.
Yeah, so I'm a third-party recruiter, so I don't work for the company. An internal recruiter works for the company, so that's like an important difference in terms of like focus. We work with several companies at the same time, so engineers typically like working with us because we don't just have one option available. We're not always trying to squeeze an engineer into one role. We're trying to work with them on their values and showing them multiple opportunities sometimes, or one opportunity depending on like what's a fit for them and what we have, versus an internal recruiter is like paid to fill roles at their company. Both are very sales focused roles at the end of the day, but also like the internal role takes on a little bit more of like that in-depth culture, kind of like HR perspective of like vetting versus, we do some of that, but it depends on how much, for each company as like basically as much as each client wants for us to be involved. Sometimes we're really involved and we basically come off like an internal recruiter, or sometimes, we only have like a certain amount of info we can give engineers.
What about how these different types of recruiters are incentivized? Or do you feel like the incentives are a little different?
Yes and no, actually. So it's kind of interesting. There's been actually a big shift in like internal recruiters the last few years.
Hmm.
So for external recruiters, we are paid by the client. We're a free service for like engineers, anyone to hear about roles. Like you don't pay us a dime. I think sometimes people that have like no familiarity with recruiters are like, wow, this was free. Yes, it is free. We are paid by the company. So, with that, I'm sure you can assume, hey, maybe they're incentivized to fill that role, right? They are getting paid commission on the role, right? But like ultimately, like the internal recruiters can, primarily they are paid by like base salary. But some companies in Chicago have actually started doing like a commission structure. Like if you get a certain amount of
Hmm.
fills per quarter, then you get a bonus or you get a bonus per hire just because it's gotten so intense to like hire. So they are kind of becoming a little bit more closer.
Hmm.
Um, Third party recruiters do work with internal recruiters. I work with internal recruiters every day. I think sometimes we always assume they're like competing. It's not necessarily that way anymore. We're usually partnering up.
Hmm. That's I wasn't actually aware of that. That they had started using the sales commission model in some cases in internal recruiters, like increasingly. But it does sound like a reasonable response to the shift in the market. That sounds it's not that surprising to me, but I wasn't even aware of that. Speaking of which, what's happening with the market? You probably have a lot of insight
That's
on that.
Yeah, that's definitely a podcast in itself, but
Yeah.
a ton. Um, I think if you also want to piggyback off the internal and external, like recruiters, what's going on
Hmm.
there? Right now it's a really good time to be a recruiter. Why is that? Because there's so many open roles. There's so many open roles across the U.S. right now that are just sitting unfilled for 6 months to 2 years to 3 years right now. So we've actually seen an increase of like recruiters from the third party and the internal perspective, like getting paid more than I've ever heard of in the market right now. And that's because the need for tech has simply like gotten a little bit unmanageable.
Hmm.
So right now, a lot of recruiters are actually looking at like, getting paid. We've seen that. But that has also transitioned to tech. And that started with tech first, with software, DevOps, QA, all salaries probably since 2020. Don't quote me on the exact percentage, but like at least in the last 2 years, I've been doing this for 4.5. Salaries are definitely up about at least 20% since 2020 before COVID.
Hmm.
And that's across the board in tech, non-tech roles. We're just seeing a real competition for talent. We've also seen a lot of layoffs. So like it's been an interesting time period and we've just seen, you and I are both in Chicago. Chicago salaries were a little bit lower than like the East Coast and the West Coast.
Hmm.
So like now we're seeing a competition from, other agencies, other companies on the East Coast and West Coast coming for like Midwest engineers. So like that's risen like all salaries across the board. And some of our Midwest clients are struggling to hire.
That definitely, with some more detail than I was aware of, resonates with what my general impression was, and
Yeah.
I think that's going to be very insightful for a lot of people that watch this. So that's got to be tough for companies that are just trying to retain talent. That all this activity is
It's
happening.
awkward. It's awkward because, right now we're working with companies on landing engineers that are coming in, like let's say you have two senior engineers. One's on the team, one's joining, and one's joining the team at 20K higher.
So what should they do in that situation? And if you have any opinion about it, like what's the
They
right?
should advise with Taylor Poiry on their hiring and retention strategies. But no, I mean, you've got to incentivize people to stay at their current job. You
Mhm.
don't want more turnover, so you've got to adjust, Don't wait for somebody to ask for a raise to give it to them, because they're probably going to find out that that engineer you just brought on makes 20K more. So, get ahead of the problem, right? Like, unfortunately, you need to adjust your salary bands, but that's also a fortunate thing because you're probably going to retain talent longer and get projects done quicker.
Yeah, like turnover is very inefficient, right? Like having to onboard new people, losing the institutional knowledge. It's really strange to me how little attention is paid often to retention, given,
Yeah.
where if we were really thinking about the cause and effect, as opposed to just, I guess local incentives create certain behaviors in businesses, no matter how well meaning the people are. That's what I
Hmm.
attribute it to. I look at it as a candidate, and I haven't really spent my entire career hopping every 2 years, but looking back, it's like, well, I guess I would have been better off if I had. What's that say that the industry is going to, you know, in some sense, make fools of people who stick around?
I have found that as true as well. I work with a ton of engineers from a ton of different backgrounds. I worked with an engineer that was working at a financial company in Chicago. They were there for probably about 13 years, straight out of school, moved up from like an intern to, a lead DevOps engineer. And then they were referred to me, and I was able to get them, I believe, a 60K pay bump. And like, that was obviously frustrating because, if their company had just been paying them like their market rate, they probably would have stayed.
So we're talking about a common mistake that companies make, which is they're willing to pay to recruit, but they're not willing to
Hmm.
pay to retain, which is
Yeah.
strange because a high performing existing employee is a proven value. Going from what common mistakes companies make, and when maybe there are some others. What are some common mistakes you see candidates making? Because you work with a lot of candidates, the breadth of your exposure to the situation, the advice you can provide, I think is really tremendous here.
Well, I have a lot of advice for candidates. Work with recruiters, right? That's the obvious plug that I'm going to say. I'm not sure exactly the statistic amount of jobs filled by recruiters that aren't even posted online. So, or the amount of engineers I've worked with that have applied to jobs that I've placed them at, or have never heard back from companies they've applied to for roles they're qualified for. So, I think, everyone thinks like applying to jobs is like the answer to how to like, see the market. Network with obviously recruiters that specialize in what you do. And like get referred to recruiters that are in kind of the space you want to be in. Actually paying attention to like, why would you want to work at these companies? What's going on in the market, talk to people on your team, go to tech meetups, get information. Usually a lot of people just don't have any info because they're not like getting outside a little bit of their bubble.
Mm.
So, getting some outside opinions. And you can always ignore them, right? And go back to your job and just be going along for it. I think that's a really good way to just start and just start building your network on LinkedIn. Like LinkedIn's honestly a great like resource. And then there's also like different job threads or like specific like networking sites that you can like network with other engineers in your market and like kind of starting at some of those points, and like finding people whose job you want and doing informational interviews. Like, hey, I'd love to hear about the company. Do you have 15 minutes to grab a virtual coffee?
Mm.
Starbucks on me, and just kind of shooting that message on LinkedIn and seeing what happens. So I think, that's one thing, like just getting outside your bubble a little bit to start.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds great. And it's also just if you're not getting a ton of practice socializing with different new people, that's a great warm up for interviewing as well. Practice is just huge.
And I also think like starting like an honest dialogue with the recruiters you're talking to, you know, I personally don't specialize in placing like engineers under 2 years. So that can be like the most difficult type engineer for me to help.
Hmm.
But, I can always refer them to people. So I think asking for referrals, and like seeing like, is there somebody above you or at a company you want to work with that you can start talking to? Because I know that's kind of the hardest thing, I see on LinkedIn about like boot camp grads looking for the first role. And like, that's obviously the hardest person for me to help. And I think sometimes in the past, people feel a little bit like ignored, obviously, by recruiters because they're like, why isn't the recruiter, giving me more info or more attention than maybe a senior recruiter? And I think you got to also understand, how that recruiter works and what they, transact or like they place most of the time. Because unfortunately, it might not be like that type of role. They might be able to refer you to somebody and like get you on an interview that way. But just having like that upfront dialogue of like the likelihood of like, an interview and just asking people that. When people ask me like, hey, do you know places that are hiring entry level? Then I give them that list. But like, I might not have something for them right that minute. So I think that's something to also understand is like the recruiter's book of business might not be what you're reaching out to them for.
I totally agree. I talk to a lot of people who are maybe just coming off a degree or they're boot campers. They're, just getting into their first couple jobs, and their
Yep.
experience with recruiters is going to be largely not too helpful. They probably wonder,
Yeah.
like, why do independent recruiters exist? They never have any jobs for me. Well, that's
Yeah.
because they tend to operate at a different part of the market. Internal recruiters are more useful when you're starting out, typically,
Yeah.
because that model works pretty well. Is like those companies have a good stream of entry level candidates in their pipeline. It's difficult to get to become at the top of that resume stack, but generally the companies don't need to employ independent recruitment agencies to secure that talent. And then, and I've seen this consistently. I talk to the same people 2, 3 years later at they're on their second, their third job, and all of a sudden at some
Mhm.
point, like something switches, and companies are now reaching out to them. If you're at that cusp, where now you've realized you have a ton more options, well, maybe reconsider some of the experiences you've had in the past. Maybe the dynamic has changed.
Yeah, and I think with that, I mean, you can always ask the external recruiter for like feedback on your resume or like roles to target or tools to learn. Like I do a lot of feedback in that area.
Hmm.
That honestly, usually an internal recruiter won't give you that same advice just because it can kind of border on like judgment or like they don't want to step too far with the company, from
Yeah.
that sake. So you can definitely get feedback from like an external, but like also like just asking. Like, I always tell people like you don't get what you don't ask for. And like that's kind of the same thing with like software engineers staying at the same company and never getting a pay raise. Like how proactive are you guys in that dialogue? Sometimes that dialogue hasn't gone on ever.
Yeah, I've talked to a lot of people, and the thing is, oftentimes the companies, I don't necessarily agree with this. It's more just sort of the reality. A lot of the time is that the companies are waiting for an employee to like figure out the promotion process on their own with very
Yeah.
little coaching, very little experience on what negotiation even is, and
Hmm.
then just thinking, well, if they don't get rewarded, then they should have learned negotiation skills. When so much that you need to do your job is talked about internally, and then there's just these sort of unwritten rules that you have to go
Yeah,
outside to learn. That's a
exactly.
paradigm shift that it can be hard to make.
And it's a bummer for sure. But I think just starting the dialogue on weird conversations or maybe uncomfortable conversations, with your boss to start, or like, some people on your team of like what they're seeing, how they feel. And then asking like the policies in place, right? Like, how does that work when somebody's up for a raise? I think probably the biggest mistake engineers do is they go to their boss when they have another offer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like they're going for essentially the counter offer, which, I highly suggest engineers against not taking, right? It's kind of like dating, if they didn't see your value then, why do you think they're going to see your value now?
Mm-hmm.
I've worked with a ton of engineers the last few years that, a few have taken counter offers, and like specifically in the Chicago tech community. And I've only seen one still remain at the company in the 4 years I've had dozens of engineers take counter offers. That's actually like work towards a promotion.
Yeah.
So like, there's like a lot on to counter offers. But I think have that conversation with leadership before you're interviewing. So that way you've got a clear, no, it's not happening, or yes, it's in process, or here's what my pay is being expanded to and when. Because if you have those combos with an offer, you're potentially burning bridges and new places that you might want to work, whether it's today or next year. And you can never go back and really ask for that redo if the same director or CTO is there. So I think being really conscious of like, hey, am I interested in a counteroffer from my company? Or, have I looked into that at all to understand like the effects behind that? Because most people that take a counteroffer don't know like, the business aspect behind it. Mm-hmm. It's like, they're not realizing from like the HR, the recruiting standpoint, the business standpoint on how hard it is to fill your role, but how easy it is to give you 20K more. So like that they can have those 6 to 8 months to fill your role again.
Right. They frequently will just be meeting the counter offer in order to then replace you, because it's easy by doing that to burn trust. It's a rare situation where that can be done well, which is not to say you can't have a compensation conversation, but I would start it with so how should this go? How should we approach this? On what timeline can we set what expectations? Start asking questions and figure out what unique dominoes this company has. It doesn't always work exactly how they present, but you need to start engaging with that, as well as being aware of what your options are, what your footing is in the market. You can use market data without presenting a counteroffer, is what I'm saying. It is still part of your calculation, one way or another. So this is where we talk about being like a passive candidate. If you're just exploring the market, right? That's terminology that you'd use a lot, right? You hear about passive seekers and
passive
active seekers.
Active.
So why would you, as a recruiter, be interested in talking to a passive seeker? That sounds like someone you're not going to be able to place. Why are the passive seekers interesting at all?
I'm curious on like the data behind this, but I would say most people I place are passive. I'm not sure the percentage, but it feels pretty high. I would say, if you're asking, hey, why is that? Usually I have ongoing relationships with people for like months to years. So I'm getting to know like their like what to keep an eye out for, essentially. If a role has XYZ, hit me up. And I start those kind of conversations with, mid-level to staff engineers every week, every day. They're like, hey, I'm happy, but I heard the market's great. Like I saw you posting online, or I saw those salary numbers and I just thought we should connect. And I'm like, okay, well, let's get into it. Like, what are the actual reasons outside of cash, or, what is it about cash that is driving you? And like, let's talk about what that means. An active job seeker is somebody that's like, hey, I need to start my role. If it's 5:15, they need to start, by the 23rd, right? Or maybe the 30th. Maybe they just got laid off, and like, we're seeing a ton of layoffs right now. So that's we are seeing a little bit of an influx of active candidates. that are pretty skilled, honestly. So they're like, hey, it's sometimes it's 2 weeks, sometimes it's 4 weeks, sometimes 2 months, but they're like, I need a job by this date. So we work with both. I think the thing about the active candidate is sometimes it is the first job, not always like the right job that they're looking for, which totally makes sense when you got bills to pay or like a family to feed. So we totally understand with them. It's just more clear on like the timeline. And then with our passive candidates, I think we also have to have an interesting discussion about how quick the market is. And like, if you like something, how you have to be prepared to honestly take it, which is kind of, a little bit different than a few years ago because of how quick companies move to offer and, aggressively offer, right? So that you don't even have to think about, whether or not you're taking it. You're just like, I gotta take it. So it's definitely a nuanced two-sided combo.
When you have that conversation, and I don't know, how much of your chess game you want to discuss here, but I imagine some of this is pretty standard. When you talk to a company about a candidate, you're on the other side of this conversation. Are you actually saying like this one's a more passive seeker? This one's not even sure that they're changing their job. Is that the sort of conversation you're having with their HR department? Or are you sort of using your best judgment?
I think it also depends on the type of role, right? So it depends on the type of company, the type of fit they are looking for, when they need somebody to start by. Some companies need somebody 2 weeks ago, and not 2 weeks ago, like 8 months ago, and they need someone. So they're going to probably prioritize the active candidate over the passive candidate. Which sometimes you can have a great dialogue around. Usually the type of companies I'm working for are looking for the right fit. So they're okay if somebody's passive or active, right? Because usually they're going to take 2 weeks before they even start at that next role, sometimes 3 to 4. So it's kind of the same for the passive or active because they're going to be putting in notice usually. So like the start date is pretty similar.
Because you do, yeah, and you did say you do place a ton of these passive candidates. So, I mean, even if they're exploring, they're maybe going to move. A lot of times that becomes yes, when they find out what's out there. So I can see where that still would be advantageous. Talking also about things that get communicated. You said earlier you like candidates to be honest with you about what kinds of things about other processes that they may be in. Maybe is that something you're able to use, and how? Because I think that's unintuitive to a lot of people who aren't used to dealing with recruiters. They think maybe they should not be talking about the other processes that they're in, because maybe they'll leave a bad impression if you're talking to other companies. How does that factor in?
Yeah, and sometimes people can definitely get prematurely, I think, a little freaked out or like, hey, no offense, like let's keep a little arm's distance away from each other, which, I work with every personality or type of person, like gladly. So, each relationship is going to be unique in terms of like how much we communicate with each other. I like to over communicate, and I prefer when engineers over communicate back, like, in terms of like details on like what they're expecting for compensation, where they're at in their search, their timeline, where they either have other intro calls or final interviews or other offers. I think that can honestly only help you because usually from my perspective, it's like, hey, if an engineer has a final interview on, let's say this week on Friday, I'm going to try to get my company in there before Thursday and making sure they're having a shot at presenting another offer. So like 2 offers is usually better than 1 for most people. So they're like, yeah, let's giddy this up. So it's more of teaming up, but obviously that has to come from like some trust and communication, or just like letting people know of like, here's where it's going, because people and like hiring managers can also be out for a week. And if that doesn't work with the candidate's schedule, like I need to know that just so they don't miss out on an opportunity they might want or the company might want to hire. So I want to keep everyone happy, at least, with the info.
So it sounds like knowing about all the processes that might be in play for the candidate, even if they're with other, agencies or with a company directly, helps you orchestrate, the situation in a way that gives, the candidate hopefully as many options when it comes time to make a decision, as well as, helping your own goals of making sure that the company you're representing is in the conversation at the right time, right? That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and off of that too, like it's kind of unique to also know what people are naturally interested in or going through other recruiters in, because let's say somebody is interviewing at a really small startup, and that's actually what they prefer, but I haven't necessarily prioritized small startups around their background. So maybe there's other clients in my network or that are coming online that week that I can get them out to proactively. But that comes from them telling me what they like. So that usually makes it easier to kind of match. So just giving more info of like, hey, this is kind of the place I'm kind of interested in on my own. Like, do you have anything similar? And then them giving me that info and I'm like, oh, okay, cool. And then I actually have this client I've done some work with. I'd love to reach out and see if they have a spot. And that's actually a lot of where my placements come from, is more like proactive, like reaching out.
Yeah, that also makes sense. We've mentioned compensation a little bit. This is something we get also a lot of questions from candidates on who are not used to
Yeah.
having those conversations, the raise conversations, the compensation conversations with a new company. So the thing that they dread, right, is you're on the phone with a recruiter, and it's that first call. You haven't even been screened yet, probably, but right away they ask, what's your target compensation, which from their perspective is a thing they want to know. They want to know if there's a match, but you're worried that, especially if you don't understand the market that well, anything you say here could work against you. You could be too high and scare them off. You could be too low and cut off your options. What should someone do in that situation? If they don't really know what their target is because they don't have a full idea of all the pieces on the board here, but they're getting asked that question in a first call.
Yeah. So I think there's two ways to think about that, is like the communication maybe to a third party recruiter and to the company itself. Those could be different depending on, how you want to approach those. But honestly, at the end of the day, like, I think you also got to think about why you're targeting that amount. I have a lot of engineers that come to me and say, my friend got, 175. And I kind of always need more like the story behind that and like that engineer skill set versus yours, right? A lot of the time it's like a story that kind of sparked a certain number. And I think it should be more based on like that engineer's background and like where they're also at financially. I think also we've seen like states get involved in like compensation conversations, like in New York and Colorado, like you have to, at least in Colorado, I know you have to disclose like the salary bands for every role on a job posting, which is kind of something new.
Yeah.
So my best advice is like being transparent on like the range you're open to. There's always that bottom number of like, hey, I'd consider this number and that number, I'm taking.
Yeah.
A lot of engineers don't know their market rate, so I always suggest using a range, and using that to start, and like kind of seeing where you fall a little bit. Like I work with a ton of engineers that like they're looking for 175 to 220. A lot of engineers right now are looking for this range, like that's very vast. And like, can obviously be nuanced with also like sign-ons, bonuses, stock and options at a company too. So it's a very complicated like offer process. So when they usually give that range, I'm like, cool, let's kind of let's go into that. And it's typically dictated by when offers start rolling in, right? Like if an engineer was targeting 170, but they got an offer for 220, they're probably not looking at 220 plus, usually.
Yeah. Unless they just absolutely hate the company they got that
Yeah.
offer. In which case, why did they get that far? Yeah. Then
Yeah, exactly. Which I'm always a fan of like, hey, if you hate it, don't take it.
as you said before, this is where aligning your process such that you have multiple offers to contend with at the same time is so advantageous. Now you have a negotiating position. It still
Hmm.
takes practice, but like at least you have a firm footing. A lot of people you talk to are probably in one of the first times in their career they've actually been in a position to negotiate, or at least knew they were in a position to negotiate, because a lot of times you are and you don't know. Because technically you are almost any time you get a job offer.
Hmm.
What else do you think is important when they're in that situation for the first time?
So I think if you're working with a third party recruiter, let's say, and you're interested in one of their companies they're presenting you to, and let's say you have another offer roll in, let the recruiter know, so that way they can communicate like to the client, so they can match or exceed your offer. I have seen engineers miss out on offers because they've been a little bit too, like dictating at the internal recruiter. So I think just making sure you're communicating like in a way that's like very formatted, condensed, concise on like where other offers are at and what you're interested in. Spelling out is not a bad thing, but I always tell people like if you're going to be negotiating offers, like my personal advice is like be prepared to take it. Like if they're going to give you the offer you want, are you going to sit on that offer for another week? How do you value like that professional, relationship? And then like people always ask me is like the one of the biggest other questions people ask me is like how long is appropriate to sit on an offer? Which I think is kind of a unique unknown thing. And I tell people like if it's the job you want, it's the salary you want, probably should take it within the day or after the weekend, 1 to 3 business days. If you have something you're genuinely interested in seeing through, typically about a week max from when the offer was generated, just because, you want to like keep those professional relationships. If that's your future boss, you don't want to leave them hanging for a month, right? So I think that's something, at least with engineers, like if it's not the job for you, move on. The market's great, but just don't drag relationships. Like have a clear timeline with each other.
Hmm. So, do you have time for one more question, Taylor?
Yeah, let's do
Um,
it.
so this one is one of the most important, I think, but might be difficult to answer because there are more caveats that can come from working with recruiters, and honestly, I don't think they're relevant so much if you work with quality recruiters. I see you as someone who has a certain amount of integrity with how you execute. So, what would you advise people to find the right recruiters to work with if they've got a bunch of people in their inbox? How can they distinguish? And you can't 100% of the time, but is there any way they can distinguish what people will be productive to work with and actually be able to do all these things that you're talking about doing successfully?
Yeah. So that's tough because, engineers are getting blown up these days and it's hard to distinct, who's legit and who's not. There can be legit recruiters that have 4 months of experience. So I know that was like something coming up. I was like, a lot of engineers would be like, you're a junior recruiter. I'm not interested. But honestly, like, I think those combos are worth like having a 10-minute combo if you're serious about your job search and you can discern that yourself. I do think, finding out their specialty or like kind of their business model is important right away of like, hey, have you placed engineers in this skill set? Or does your team work with this kind of, like day to day? Is this something you do or is there somebody else you could refer me to? And then figuring out like the communication timeline, like, hey, how often should we be talking? I think a lot of engineers expect their recruiters to be like calling them 24/7. Like if there's a role you're interested in, feel free to follow up every day, every other day with the recruiter. Typically they're managing anywhere from like 20 to 50 relationships at a time with candidates. So it can become a little taxing. So make it a two-way street and make sure you're communicating with them on like, your activity level, what companies you're interested in, which ones you'd like to hear back from, maybe asking if they have a relationship with something you saw posted online. Remembering that recruiters are human. They're not always going to have the best screen if it's their 10th screen of the day. So just like having a humanistic phone call and then like asking, likeliness of like having some potential fits if that one they mentioned wasn't an exact fit. So I think that's a really good way to start. I think a lot of engineers like put little asterisks in their names to make sure like the in-mails are personalized nowadays, like making sure it's very tailored to them because a lot of people are so tired of spam and, we're tired of sending spam. So like if I send an in-mail to an engineer and they're like, hey, this isn't something I'm interested in, usually I've taken like at least 3 minutes to look at their background and I thought it was close-ish. So I'm usually like following up and being like, hey, what would you be interested in? Just shooting a message back. Like you don't have to get on the phone just to like give them like some of your hot buttons you're looking for. I'm looking for this title, this tech stack, this comp range. And then boom. Oh, hey, I should have mentioned that one too. My bad. Are you free today past 3? And let's talk about it. It's that easy.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the channel. I know from the last interview episode we have that people are just going to love this. I get questions about interviews all the time. So I'll let you plug your pluggables, any parting words, and we'll sign off.
Thank you, Ray. I'm excited to hear the feedback. If you're looking for a job, if you need help hiring for that role that's been open for 6 months, feel free to message me on LinkedIn, Taylor Poiry. I'd love to help you out. And if you just need somebody to like double glance at your resume, I also do that as well. So happy to just network with people that have questions about the market. It's still hot. And like just be, somebody for you in your career as much as I can.
And as Lao Tzu said in the Tao Te Ching, with patience, the most tangled cord may be undone. Thank you.
Maybe. Thanks, Ray.